This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of the In Focus podcast. This time there won't be one host for all of you guys listening. There are two of us, myself, Sampath, and Zubeda, Hamid, who has been doing a ton of podcasts this year. And between the two of us, we decided to bring you a special edition of the year's podcast. What you can call it a year-ender perhaps. And in this particular edition, we're going to be picking from all the podcasts we have done from Jan 1st to this month, the top 6 podcasts that we have done. And we each have our own lists. They are not the same based on what we have done and the people you have spoken to, the subjects you have covered. And by top 6, I don't necessarily mean the top 6 in terms of the best 6. We have used a set of criteria which we will explain. And very quickly, I just want to tell you what those criteria are, and then we will go through them one by one so that you understand why we are doing this. First, of course, is diversity and spread of themes that we have covered through the year. Secondly, we also looked at the podcast in such a way that we are able to cover all the big stories that have unfolded both in India and elsewhere through the year. Third, of course, a sense of discovery. If you are a listener and if you're listening to this, you should feel ideally that you have learned something new and it should want you to go on and discover more on the subject. Fourth, plugging a gap where there has not been adequate coverage in the media, which we have done consciously in the In Focus series. And 5, some kind of an enduring value to the podcast. As journalists in this field, using this medium, we are always driven by the news cycle. If we track the news, we follow the news, and we want to give you some kind of an instant understanding, explanation of why something that has gone down has gone down. But we also have done quite a few deep dive podcasts where we try and give value for listeners that would actually stand the test of time. There are certain issues which don't really begin and end in a matter of a week or a month. So there is a longer shelf life factor also that we have considered in selecting these 6 podcasts, mine and Zubeda's. And you might be wondering why 6? Because we didn't want to go with 5, which is what everybody else does. So this is roughly what we have in mind, and I wanted to ask you, Zubeda, your thoughts on how you came about approaching this particular episode, which is unlike every other episode you have done. I have done because we are used to hosting. Now we are not just hosting; we are also doing much more than that.
Thanks, Sampath. Yeah, that was a very nice sum up of how we came up with the podcast list for this year. And yes, you're right. We're usually used to being the persons who ask the questions rather than those who are giving the answers. So this is a nice change for both of us, I think. Ed, your list was quite comprehensive as to how we came up with the top 6 podcasts for the year. Also, of course, like to be able to give a slightly more in-depth look to our listeners, because sometimes you can't always get everything that you want to know about a particular subject, say through one news article or even multiple news articles. It's nice to have an expert telling you how this issue plays out and what are the ramifications of a particular piece of news that you might have come across. And also perhaps giving you a perspective that you might not have thought of by yourself. So it's nice to have that sort of a perspective coming from an expert. And it's, as you said, it's nice to have like a list that also endures. So you might have come across an issue towards the beginning of the year, but it might be continuing to have an impact in India, in your lives, in the political sphere throughout the year. So that was also part of the criteria that we chose. Since my area deals a lot with health and nutrition, social and legal issues, again, these are issues that constantly come up. It's not something that you decide to look at one day and then forget about the next day. It's something that endures throughout the year.
Right, absolutely. Also, one of the points I wanted to make when I sort of explained these criteria was that it also sort of makes it okay. We have done, I think, I don't know how many. More than 150 this year. So in terms of when you pick just 6, 6 mine, 6 yours, 12, you are leaving out a lot. And that doesn't mean the ones which don't figure in this list are in any way less worthy of attention. To give you a simple example, one of the big stories of the year, which continues from last year, is the Gaza war. And we have done a ton of podcasts on Gaza. There are multiple dimensions to this conflict, very complicated. The entire West Asia involved, not just West Asia, the US, Russia, so many things happening. And we have done more than a dozen on this subject. But I'm going to pick only one. That doesn't mean the other five are anyway lesser. So this is to do with diversity, because we also wanted to tell our readers about the other podcasts we have done. And secondly, the whole question of big stories. One of the big stories of the year is Adani. And we have done one podcast on Adani, which is very, very different from what most people have been following with regard to the Adani story, which is the Kenyan dimension, so that we'll talk about it when we come to that. So that is one example of covering the big stories, and also in a way that most media houses or most of the media as such in India haven't really given it that much of space. So that is one. And of course, when I spoke about curiosity, there are certain things one comes across as a journalist, but you don't always get an opportunity to go deep into it, because as we all know, we are like slaves of the news cycle. But there are certain topics where you, because of the nature of the medium, you are getting an expert on board to talk about it. You can ask all kinds of questions and it's okay, you won't look like a fool. So that is one of the things which I wanted to sort of capture the way I selected these podcasts. And I think two of those themes we hear, which I wanted to include was, one is of course fortified rice, which not many of us know much about it, because it comes in it's sort of directed at a different set of people section who need it apparently. And the other, of course, is the great Nicobar Island project, which is a huge topic. We'll come to it as that as well. So these are some of the issues, I think, some of the criteria we wanted to sort of include and also select and deselect episodes. I think enough of the rationale now. I think we can go ahead and start with our list itself. And this is a list I think many of you would want to go back and listen if you haven't listened to them already, or maybe give it a second one if you haven't really been able to do it earlier. So the number 6 episode on your list of top 6, Zubeda, you want to start with that?
Sure, Sampath. Just one quick point to add to our rationale as well. These might not be the top 6 in terms of most listened to, but it is our personal selection of what we think are the top 6 episodes of the year. And as Sampath said, this hopefully all our readers will go back and listen to these episodes. The one I considered the 6th most important episode on in my list was an issue that made the news, made the headlines, and was talked about for months together, which was the Wayanad landslide in Kerala. Over 400 people died in this landslide. Hundreds were missing for days. It was an absolute tragic situation in Kerala. So one of the things that emerged from the huge tragedy that unfolded in Wayanad earlier this year was that the Western Ghats Ecology Expert Panel that was set up in 2011, led by a very famous environmental scientist Madhav Gadgil, had said that this entire region of 129,000 square kilometers was ecologically sensitive, and that there should be a very strict restriction on the kind of development that is allowed inside this region. However, of course, this can have a lot of ramifications in terms of the economy and the livelihoods of the people who are living in this particular region. And
these restrictions don't really work, do they? Have these?
They don't. That is what my guest the expert that I had interviewed had said, that because of the kind of populations that we have living in these regions and the kinds of economic considerations that we have also in terms of tourism, in terms of development, in terms of making facilities available for the people living in these regions, development cannot be completely stalled. It is not an easy ask to ask a state to section off lakhs and lakhs of acres and just say that nothing can happen in this region, correct?
So is there a balance way? How do you deal with this kind of a landslide situation, which we find even in Uttarakhand, it's been happening, right?
Yes. The idea is to grade perhaps these regions into sort of sensitive, more sensitive, and highly sensitive, and then see what you can do in those particular zones that are considered very, very sensitive to problems like landslides or flooding, etc. So the center, following the landslide, brought out for the sixth time in 10 years yet another draft notification talking about how we can classify ecologically sensitive regions, especially those in the Western Ghats, and the mountainous regions, which are very prone to things like landslides. This is an ongoing conversation, though, Sampath. The center has now asked for the states to give in their inputs, and the states, of course, will have considerations that are not strictly environmental. They will have other considerations as well for their populations. So this is a conversation that has to be ongoing, I think.
Yeah, it has to be ongoing, and I'm sure I mean it will come up again as a disaster. Unfortunate, to
Right.
even think in that way. But going by the past track record of ours, I think these landslides seem to somehow carry less weight. I mean, the tragedy that comes with it, so many lives, hundreds of lives lost.
Right.
They don't seem to
Right.
carry the same weight in the imaginations of planners and politicians as the so-called developmental developmental priorities. Developmental priorities are there, but if people are not, I mean, what happened to the development of the 400 people who lost their lives in Wayanad, for example? What
That
development?
is a crucial question. Absolutely. I agree with you. Another thing that came up during that particular podcast was the effect that climate change and increasingly what is going on with climate adverse events that we are seeing more and more of in India, how advanced warning systems can be implemented in these regions, especially, and how really, really small changes that take place elsewhere, for instance, it might not even be happening in Kerala. It might be something to do with the oceans, something to do with the winds and the tides elsewhere, but how these impacts can play out in different regions of the country, and the necessity for really strong surveillance and warning systems for these particular regions. So that's something else that is being worked upon. India has gone some way ahead in terms of implementing these systems, but there is a lot more work that needs to go on, especially in the regions, as you pointed out, in Uttarakhand, in Kerala, and all of the regions that have mountains in them.
Right. I mean, this is absolutely an important topic. I think ecology, climate change, development, tourism, livelihoods, all of these are interconnected issues, and they are reflected in this
It's a difficult
particular.
balance. It's a very difficult balance to achieve.
Now, moving on to my number six
Yes. Can you
selection.
talk to us a little bit? Your number six was, as you pointed out a little earlier, the distribution of fortified rice through the public distribution system. We know that India has the largest PDS ration shop system, basically, in the world, providing food and other basic necessities to a large section of the population. Tell us a little bit about the center's pilot project to provide fortified rice. Why is there objection to this? Why don't people like this rice?
Right. First of all, I got to talk to Anumeha Yadav, who's a journalist who has done extensive ground reportage on this subject. And fortified rice, there is no scientific backing saying that, there is no scientific research which is sort of saying unambiguously that it is going to help with anemia. Okay. Number one, it doesn't do clearly what it is meant to do. Number two, we don't have the infrastructure to make sure that the plastic rice, which is what the people who are supposed to consume it, they're calling it plastic rice. It tastes like plastic, it doesn't taste like rice. Number one, they hate it. And secondly, it's got a lot of what should I say, dangers, health risks for people who have thalassemia. And what if a poor person who's got thalassemia or sickle cell anemia, for example, if they have these conditions, and if they don't want to have, they are advised medically not to have this fortified rice, where do they go for normal rice? What is what can they do about it? So there is no choice available to those who don't want to or cannot have fortified rice. So given this context, it is very difficult to understand why the government is so heavily pushing a fortified rice literally down the throats of the poor through the welfare system. I mean, and we did this podcast, I think, much earlier in the year, I think around Feb, March. And last month, the Union Cabinet has approved the continuation of free fortified rice under the ration shop, various welfare schemes, right up to December 2028. It's going at a really fast speed, and if you want to know what exactly it is that is driving this mega push towards fortified rice in a country where local grain varieties with higher iron content is available. India has no dearth of natural rice varieties with higher iron content, but we want this rice which is fortified with iron. Why are we doing this? I think you need to listen to the podcast because there are a lot of things which you may not be aware of, which are driving this kind of a policy push, and some of them are commercial as well. I don't want to say this more, so that so you guys go and check out this podcast. It's an amazing podcast. Anume has done a beautiful job of explaining, breaking down the entire process of what's wrong with this fortified rice push. Why are people saying they don't want it? Why they're calling it plastic rice? And those who are even more curious, I would encourage them to actually buy maybe half a kilo of it and cook it and try and have it themselves.
Moving on to my number 5, I had done a podcast on the outbreak of Mpox in various parts of Africa and its rapid spread to several other countries, including very close to our neighborhood. Pakistan reported cases, Thailand reported cases. There have been several cases now reported in Europe. And just today, there was a headline stating that 2 cases have now been reported in Kerala.
Is this the same as monkeypox, or is it something else?
Yes, Sampath, it is. So the virus is known as the monkeypox virus, but the disease is now known as Mpox because the WHO and various countries felt that monkeypox was not quite a suitable name to be calling a disease. And it's the same thing. So it's called Mpox now. It has been around for decades, actually. But the particular variant that has broken out earlier this year in Africa, which is called Clade 1b, happens to be far more virulent than the previous strains of this particular disease, which makes it more transmissible, which makes it more fatal, especially to children. So, as you know, ever since the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, there has been a lot of interest in emerging new diseases. What is going to happen? Is it going to affect us? And if it does affect us, how do we know that this is the particular disease that, that has outbroken all over the world? Because there are so many flus, viruses, and things going around. So it's nice to have an idea as to what this particular disease is and what is your risk quotient for it.
Right. I mean, is it like, do we have vaccines, etc., for it?
Right. So there are a couple of vaccines for it, Sampath, but as we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, vaccine equity continues to remain a huge issue, as has been the case over here. The rollout of the vaccines was fairly slow, which means that Africa, which is the region that is most affected, got them months after the outbreak broke out. The vaccines have arrived in Africa now, but again, because of the supply issues, they are being restricted to the most vulnerable populations. Not everybody has access to them, just like we did during the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. The vaccines are again not universally available. Not every country has stocks of these. It has been an ongoing issue in Africa now with regard to their access for vaccines. And now that the disease has entered Indian shores, the central government has said that we're going to scale up surveillance, we're going to scale up testing, which is the main thing. If you can test for it quickly, confirm quickly that it is the particular disease that you're looking for, then it's far easier to begin treatment quickly.
Right. I mean, it's good to know because we do have, I mean, ever since COVID, I think it's on everybody's mind, the latest variant of the latest.
Correct. What is going on with the latest variant of the latest disease? Yes. And what to know about it.
Yes. Absolutely. And then they got all these, I don't know, strange names with, it's Mpox, What does M stand for?
It's the original virus is called monkeypox virus because it's a zoonotic virus, which means that we probably got it from wild animals. And that has been an increasing trend, which you will know, of course, that like almost all of the latest pathogens that have come in the news, such as if you think of Nipah, if you think of Mpox, if you think even of COVID-19, which is believed to have come from bats, but that's not 100% confirmation, that all of these viruses are coming in from the natural world, from the forests into our homes, which again puts the focus on how are we going to tackle this challenge of environmental health and human health together in order to ensure that human health is protected.
Right. I'm sure there is, this ties in with your Wayanad episode as well, where you are destroying forests there.
Yes. The concept of One Health is gaining ground now, but yes, listeners do listen to this Mpox podcast where Dr. Ramasubramanian, who's an infectious disease specialist, really breaks down what you need to know about it. And what you need to do in case you think that that there's somebody in your family who may perhaps have contracted it.
Now, Zubeda, coming to my number 5 selection, it is an episode on the Waqf Amendment Bill 2024. As you know, the Union government recently introduced this bill in the Lok Sabha to amend the 1995 Waqf Act, and this Waqf Act is basically governs the administration of Waqf, which are properties endowed for charitable or religious purpose under Islamic law. Now, this act has been in place for a long time, but now suddenly you have this bill which is brought in to amend this act, and the minorities, the Muslims, those who have been involved in administration of Waqf properties and the community as a whole is opposed to this bill, and they believe that this is an attempt to sort of deprive them of their right to administer these properties as they have done for a long time. There are also provisions to sort of reduce a Muslim representation and control over the administrative agencies that sort of oversee this entire process. So what exactly this bill is trying to do? Is it an extension of this entire Hindu-Muslim thing that has been going on, or is there a genuine case for making these amendments so that these properties are administered more efficiently? But that doesn't seem to be the case because of the way the entire process has happened. We know from this podcast, for example, there has hardly been any consultation with the stakeholders from the Muslim community in this process, And even in the Joint Parliamentary Committee, there have been, every time it's met, it's been like completely controversial. People have walked out of those meetings, opposition members saying, you've got organizations from the majority community coming and deposing before committees. So it's been like a very controversial kind of an undertaking.
Tell us, what is the central government's purported aim? What are they saying that this bill is supposed to achieve?
The central government's purported aim is to sort of, quote unquote, enhance the efficiency of the administration and management of the Waqf properties. Waqf properties across country, I think it goes into lakhs of crores of rupees, as do the properties owned by other religious, properties under the urges of other religious bodies, from other religions. So they have had a certain ways of being governed, but now the government of India wants to change it. Fuzail Ahmad Ayubi, who is an advocate with the Supreme Court of India, he's the guy who came on board to talk to us about this, and he has been someone who has done a great amount of research, especially on the legal side on this particular topic, and I think it's a very informative kind of a podcast. I think this issue is not going to go away anytime soon. It will come up again because the JPC is there, which is sort of been working on this, and I think it will come up in Parliament and in the news again next year as well. So this is one episode, I think, from the point of view of shelf life, for sure, enduring appeal, it is absolutely something which I think we have done a creditable job of sort of bringing it in focus and helping people to understand what are the issues at stake, what is it for the different stakeholders, what the government is trying to do, what the opposition has been saying, and so on and so forth.
My number 4 was about this entire controversy that erupted earlier this year about how multinational companies, in this particular case Nestle, which is like a household name in India when it comes to baby cereals, Cerelac, etc., it has been found that Nestle has been adding almost 3 grams of extra sugar in our infant cereals and baby cereals like Cerelac, whereas if you look at the same product in Europe, it does not have this added sugar. So why should our babies be exposed to sugar, which by now everybody knows can contribute to a host of problems in the body, including it's one of the factors that contributes to obesity, it contributes to diabetes, it contributes to a bunch of non-communicable diseases later in life. So why are we exposing our babies to sugar, whereas the same babies in Europe are having healthier foods?
So where is this coming from? I'm just curious. Should the question be, why is Nestle adding added sugar to its products in India, or is it that Nestle is able to get away with doing this because our regulation is so poor?
It's both, Sampath, and that's a good way of putting it. It's both, because the European consumers and the European regulations have really kept pace with the times in terms of being able to amend their regulations in order to do away with problems such as this. So their food safety regulations are extremely stringent. Their food packaging laws, how you're supposed to label your food in order to ensure that consumers can read those labels and understand what is in the food, are also extremely stringent. Whereas we as a country are really lagging behind when it comes to this. Nestle and other multinational companies can simply get away with this. They can get away with it in not just in India, but in many parts of the developing world by just adding a little more sugar, making it maybe a little more tasty. Therefore, if you think that your baby likes it, you will go out and buy more of their products, correct? And so that is what is going on over here, despite the fact that, as I said, everybody knows that sugar is extremely harmful for the body. You're not supposed to have any kind of added sugar or added salt in your food until you're 2 years of age, because these are the two problems that can then these are the two compounds that can later lead to problems in life. But we do not have adequate stringent food safety regulations. And another thing, I spoke to Dr. Arun Gupta, whose organization has been working continuously on things like labeling for packaged and processed food, on things like sugar being added to infant food. And he pointed out to me that it's not just about adding the sugar and then marketing the product, despite the fact that India has a law that says you cannot promote baby food in any way, in any form of advertisement. What has now been going on is that traditional advertisements are not being used, so maybe they're complying with the letter of the law, but there is a lot of promotion going on social media, which, as we know, has penetrated deeply into India. Everybody is on social media, and therefore all of these companies are able to promote their products through that as well.
Right. We definitely need, I think, better regulation, and this involves really small children, babies. And I think there is no scope, for laxity here at all, given the stakes here involved. Small children, if they grow up with this kind of extra sugar in their system, they are going to be diabetic, I think, very soon, and diabetic, not just diabetes, but other kinds of health issues as well, right?
Absolutely. Considering India is the diabetes capital of the world, this is something we need to be taking extremely seriously.
I think this is how we became the diabetes capital of the world, actually.
Possibly. And as you said, this is also an enduring issue because this is not the first report. Another recent report last week in the news found that, again, the same problem of like multinational corporations selling less healthy products in the developing world and more healthy products in the developed world where regulations are stringent. So this is something that the government needs to act on and act on soon. Big food is becoming a huge problem here. Let's move on to your number 4, your top 4th episode. You had done an episode on the Kenyans protesting against the Adani takeover of their airport, correct?
So, one of the reasons I wanted to pick this was Adani is one of the big stories of the year. We know about the indictment in the US. It was all over the page 1 of every newspaper for quite a while. It was on TV, it was on social media. And way before all that happened, we had done this episode on the Kenyan airport workers protesting against the proposed takeover by the Adani group of the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport in Nairobi. The Kenyan government had signed a $2.5 billion build and operate deal with the Adani group. And under the agreement, the Adanis were going to renovate the airport, add a new runway, terminal, and in exchange, they would get to manage the airport for 30 years, after which, after having obtained the revenue for operations for 30 years, they would also get an 18% equity stake in the airport. Now, of course, this would mean privatization in a big way. So airport workers, they would have, many of them anticipated or probably feared that they would be laid off or their salary packages would get affected. So they took to protesting, and by the way, this entire thing was started off by a whistleblower who actually posted it anonymously on social media. And from that, all the protests started and it became a political issue. And the protests by the airport workers led to a lot of flight cancellations. And the Kenyan Human Rights Commission got involved. They filed an application in the High Court. And very interestingly, the Kenyan judiciary said, okay, complete full stop to this. Nothing is going to happen until we've looked at the whole thing and we get to the bottom of this. And eventually, the pressure from the public was so much that the deal is now completely off. And it's an amazing story to talk about. And when I spoke to our guest for this episode, Richard Onyanka. He is a senator, pretty senior person in the Kenyan politics. He's a member of the Kenyan Parliament representing Kisii County. And he was actually, when I spoke to him that very day, he was just coming out of a meeting where they were going to get the government to explain to Parliament about how they went about signing this agreement and get the bureaucrats also involved. And he had just come out of that meeting, and when he spoke to us for about 20 minutes about how this whole thing was unfolding. So it's an excellent kind of an introduction to the way multinational groups from India have been operating in other parts of the world, the kind of deals they have been trying to make with the government, and also this particular case of Kenya. And this was before all the allegations we heard about from the US indictment.
That's, as you said, Sampath, a lovely story with a happy ending. It's nice to know that one whistleblower's effort led to the entire deal being called off. And it's as you said, like, it gives us an insight into how corporations from India function in other parts of the world, as well as, of course, in India. And it's heartwarming to know that this actually led to all of the action that happened, including what happened in the court and what happened in the parliament.
What about your next in the list, Zubeda?
Yes. Yes, Sampath. My number 3 was actually about an insight into the bail system that operates in India. I began this podcast after, as all of you would have heard, the death of former Delhi University professor G.N. Sai Baba. He was incarcerated. He was jailed for 10 years on terror charges, of which he was found completely innocent and acquitted on every single charge by the Bombay High Court. And just a few months after he was released from jail, he passed away. I was interested to do this because during the entire course of his incarceration, he had repeatedly been denied medical treatment. He had been denied medical bail during the pandemic when pretty much everybody else had got medical bail. He was denied emergency bail during the death of his mother. And Professor Sai Baba was 90% disabled. He was a wheelchair user and he was in jail for 10 years. I wanted to understand how the bail system in India works. And my guest, if all of you would listen, this is something I would urge every one of our listeners to listen to, because it is not something everybody comes across in day-to-day life, but it gives you an insight into the functioning of our criminal judicial system, which I think is critical for everybody to know about. Bail, essentially, Sampath, is only available and accessible to those with resources, which means that a huge section of a population in a country like ours simply does not have the resources, the access to get bail. So even if they're jailed for something as small as a petty theft, you might be, I don't know, stealing something really tiny of something, or you might not even have stolen it. You might have just been suspected of stealing it. Your access to bail will only come if the police and the court systems believe that you have enough money, that you have property, or that you know enough people with enough money. And of course, that is not the case for all of us.
Right. I think this is, a very, very important issue with sort of multiple ramifications, is what I would imagine. Because most of the people in jail in India, aren't they all, most of them under trials?
Yes, about 60 to 70% are under trials, which just tells you that by under trials for our listeners means that somebody has been arrested on the basis of the police suspecting that they have committed a crime, but they have not yet gone through a trial and they have not yet been convicted of that crime. They're simply in jail prior to the entire judicial process taking place.
Right. So if you have committed a crime for which, say, the sentence is 5 years, and you have an under trial who's been in jail for 4 years, you have not been convicted, but you have served a sentence of 4 years for what exactly?
Yes, absolutely, Sampath. And the Law Commission of India has year after year in its reports pointed out that so many people in our jails are serving time equal to the sentence of the crime, or sometimes even more than the sentence of the crime. And at least these people should be released on a priority basis. Because even if they're convicted of having done that crime, they would have already done their jail term. But sadly, and this could be, at least this is what researchers think, it could be one of the reasons our jails are simply so overcrowded. They have filled to capacity and more, actually, in every part of this country.
Right. I think over and above this fundamental issue of liberty and justice, And bail being, I mean, we keep hearing bail is the rule and jail is the exception, but in India, I think the reverse is the true.
Absolutely not. Absolutely. That's the thing. The Supreme Court says that bail should be the rule and jail should be the exception. But for it to filter down to every local magistrate court in every district of India, that simply does not happen.
I think it doesn't even filter down to all the judges on the Supreme Court. I mean,
Yes, as we know from recent experience.
yes, yes, unfortunate. I think the people should listen to this bail episode as well. I think to understand why this is the way it is. I think from there, I think there should be some public conversation, more public conversation about why India is so happy to put people in jail without having convicted them, and keep them jailed even without even having a trial started. Forget conviction. There are so many names we can think of where there hasn't even been a trial going on and people are kept perpetually in jail under various draconian laws.
Yes, and Medha Dio, my guest, was excellent. Please do take a listen to this. As I keep telling everybody, anybody at any point in time could get involved in the criminal justice system, and it is good to know what it's going to be like.
Right, it's not a very pleasant thought.
Well, we are in the journalism field, Sampath.
Right. Now, coming to my number 3, it is the electoral bonds verdict of the Supreme Court.
It's superb judgment of this year, yes.
Yeah, a few positive highlights of the year. A 5-judge constitution bench of the Supreme Court unanimously struck down the centre's electoral bond scheme. I mean, these electoral bonds enabled anonymous political donations, where the voter could not know, how much money is going to whom, from where, and the apex court, the Supreme Court, sort of called it unconstitutional, and it states that it is in violation of right to information under Article 19(1) of the Constitution. So there are many questions. Why didn't this happen sooner? I mean, we have had elections happening with this electoral bonds thing in place. How do we understand the legitimacy, quote unquote, of those elections? If it has been one using these unconstitutional means as one of the tools of campaigning and so on, like, shouldn't there be some kind of compensation? And what is the consequence of having broken the constitutional remit in these matters? And there is no consequences at all. So these are some of the questions that I ask Jagdeep S. Chokar from the Association of Democratic Reforms, a non-profit, which was actually one of the petitioners in this case, where the Supreme Court delivered this verdict. He sort of does a good job of explaining how the electoral bond scheme worked and why it is a violation of constitutional norms. It is also a violation of right to information. And subsequently, of course, once State Bank of India put out the entire details, how much money has come to which political party and who are the top donors. I think many journalists did a great job, including the Hindu in particular, of making connections and sort of putting it out there for the public to make up their own minds on how the electoral bonds have shaped Indian elections and Indian politics.
Very, very crucial episode, especially as it ties into how our democracy functions, Sampath. And as you said, one of the pieces of good news from this year that we have had. My number 2 was on the highly anticipated census and perhaps the delimitation that might take place after that. As we all know, and as Sampath has done an episode on before, India's census has been delayed for several years now, and this actually has never happened since we've had independence. So it's been a one-off. It's been a completely people have begun to question. Experts have wondered why we've not had a census. In case our listeners don't know, we were supposed to have the census in 2021 after the 2011 census, but that did not happen due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the resultant lockdown that was there that year. However, it did not happen in 2022, 2023, or 2024. So now we are more than 3 years overdue. My podcast explored what is going to happen post the census, which has been announced for next year. The central government has made a few remarks indicating that they might start on a delimitation process. Delimitation means the redrafting of the constituencies based on population numbers. Now, in India, we have had a freeze on delimitation since the 1971 census. And this freeze was done in order to ensure that states who have implemented their population control measures very well and that is primarily the southern states, will not be penalized with having fewer constituencies as opposed to states where population control measures are taking a little longer. We spoke to Professor Sonalde Desai for this, who has done a lot of work on population studies. And she talked to us about what is going to happen if delimitation takes place, why are southern states so concerned about what could happen, and what could perhaps a fairer system for the whole country look like, because the country has not progressed at an even rate or pace when it comes to population control measures. The basic idea behind democracy, of course, is one person, one vote. But over time, when populations grow at different levels, this might not always be fair, she pointed out. For instance, in Bihar, studies have found that one MP represents 3.1 million people. But if you come down to Kerala, one MP represents 1.75 million people. A huge difference in numbers. So this is why she was pointing out that what could possibly happen when delimitation takes place, and how could we ensure that states who have performed well do not feel like they are penalized by having fewer MPs represent them in parliament?
Right. I mean, so if delimitation does go through, wouldn't it automatically mean that South India is going to get less representation compared to
Yes,
North India? And as a result of
most
that,
likely.
yeah, and if that happens, then politicians from North India can just forget about South India. They can, if they get, if you win the Hindi heartland, you are getting a majority, right?
Absolutely. It really is a question of what will happen to this whole north-south divide, Sampath, because that is and that is going to play out very quickly. Because, as I said, both Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu both have expressed concerns about the fact that this could impact them pretty badly. And do we need to have another freeze? Do we need to continue the 1971 freeze? Do we need to come up with a slightly fairer system as to in terms of who represents what and how many representations are given for particular states? This is a conversation that needs to be had fairly urgently.
This is something, this subject has exercised me also for quite some time now. I've been thinking about this. I was just wondering if it came up in your episode. Is there any way of addressing this sort of unfair representation for the South post delimitation in the first past the post system? I think we necessarily have to switch to proportionate representation. Otherwise, how are we going to ensure? Because there is a really politically, it makes no sense for anybody to invest resources in the South if you can just manage with the North. Did the proportionate system come up at all? Or
we did talk about what a fairer system could look like, and Professor Sonalde Desai did suggest that, for instance, what the United States does, with their House of Representatives and their Senate, could perhaps, with the lower house and the upper house being, because in the United system, that's how it works. In the Senate represents equally. It does not depend upon the population numbers. So perhaps that could be something that, could lead to a fairer system. But as I said, this is a conversation that needs to be had, because otherwise, how do you not penalize, or how do you not how does the South not feel like that it's being penalized for having better population control measures, better health systems, and better social determinants overall? So that is, and as you said, resources then, and how do you then ensure that your economic resources of the center are also divided fairly? Should states that are doing slightly better automatically not get adequate funds? Is that how it should be? And obviously, you want to give the funds to states that need it more. But does that mean that you do not equally address the other needs of perhaps more developed states? How does this all work out?
Right, absolutely. I think this is another subject which is just going to have an enduring kind of relevance.
Absolutely.
It's not going to go away. In fact, it's going to only increase in the coming months and years as this delimitation issue comes up
Right,
again and takes center stage. Yeah, sorry.
Right. Now, moving on to your number two, Sampath, that is an issue that, again, as you said, has been continuing since last year. Yahya Sinwar's death and how it plays out in the entire Gaza situation at the moment. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, we've been doing a lot of podcasts on the West Asia conflict, especially Israel and Gaza, and we've continued it from October 7th onwards, last year. And we did a 3-part series, with Stanley Johnny, which did really well. A lot of people sort of got onto this issue after listening to it. and it still has a lot of it's a classic, I would say. But going on from that, one of the events of this year which really grabbed headlines was the assassination of Yahya Sinwar, the leader of the Palestinians in Gaza. And for this episode, I got someone from the West, Dr. Andreas Krieg is an associate professor at King's College London, School of Security and Defense Studies. And one of the reasons I picked this episode was I think for the first time, I got a clear sort of a sense of the thinking among certain sections of the West. For the first time, I could hear someone from the West saying very clearly that the Israel and the US were not really interested in dialogue, diplomacy. If you remember from the beginning, everybody has been talking about pushing for ceasefire. There was this entire effort to get some kind of ceasefire deal going, wherein Israel would get its hostages in Gaza back in exchange for agreeing to a ceasefire. But from this episode, it became pretty clear to me that the West and Israel and the US were just not interested in ceasefire in any serious sense. And it sort of, Andreas explains it really well. When you kill Yahya Sinwar, what happens is you cut off the last channel of communication between Hamas leaders in Qatar and elsewhere, and the one guy in Gaza who's actually leading the resistance. Sinwar was the guy who knew where the hostages were. You knew where they were, how they were. And with him gone, there was no way you're going to get whoever was of handling the resistance in Gaza. You wouldn't be able to. There was no way you could get through to Hamas fighters in Gaza. So if you can't get through to them, how are you going to get them to promise to release the hostages? So it sort of makes it very clear that dialogue and ceasefire talks were not really being taken seriously. They were more to buy time. That is number one. And secondly, it also came through pretty clearly to me for the first time that there is a lot of disaffection in the West with how the governments were dealing with Netanyahu. It's a complete washout. I mean, many people in the West, including from the security establishment, are not happy with the way the UK and the US sort of keeling over and giving into every single of Netanyahu's demands, not sort of putting any kind of checks in the way he's sort of going ahead with this slaughter, this absolute slaughter in Gaza, then Lebanon, as well. So I think this is a very interesting kind of a conversation we had, and tremendous clarity from Andreas in terms of understanding the various militant groups, how the internal structure of Hamas, which I heard for the first time, how they operate, the division of responsibilities between the political side and the communication side, and so on. So I think it's a very interesting episode for all those reasons, and also it's a good lead into the other podcast on Israel and Palestine that we have done this year.
Absolutely. I would urge all of our listeners to listen to this. As you said, Sampath, this is going to be enduring because the war is still ongoing, the slaughter is still ongoing, and it's nice to know what the perspective is from the West with regard to this. I'm sure that has provided extremely valuable insights into how this is being viewed across the world.
Yeah, no, finally, your number one podcast.
Yes.
To know more about this, yeah.
So, absolutely. So, Sampath, so I circled back to health for this particular episode, and primarily because this year there was a lot, and as there always is as winter approaches, a lot of talk about pollution in the Delhi NCR region, and also, of course, across the rest of North India and other parts of India, as to what air pollution is really doing. And I wanted to have a conversation about the fact that while all of us think air pollution, breathing, and therefore, people will have respiratory problems, will have asthma, will have other kinds of issues, nobody has really talking too much about the fact that air pollution is very, very intricately linked to heart disease, and that air pollution is one of the leading causes of heart disease and heart deaths now when it comes to India. A recent study has found that 2.18 million Indians die per year due to air pollution, and 30% of these are because of heart disease caused by air pollution. So we spoke to Professor Srinath Reddy, who is a public health professional and a cardiologist with regard to this. And he was explaining to us what exactly PM 2.5, which I think all our listeners must have heard a lot about by now, particulate matter 2.5, the really, really tiny fine particles of pollution, what it does to your heart. Essentially, what it does is it clogs up the blood vessels of your heart, making them narrower and making them more prone to clotting. So that is the primary risk that air pollution poses. The second thing that it does is that because your blood is not flowing properly through your blood vessels, the heart tends to pump faster, which means that your blood pressure rises. And because this places a strain on your heart muscle, that becomes weaker. And that again can contribute to heart disease. So all of this is done primarily due to pollution. And Sampath, what he said was that if you are somebody who is at risk, it's not necessary that you be exposed to this every day. Even one chronic, suppose you already are vulnerable to heart disease, even one chronic incident of you being exposed to like a whole lot of pollution in like the space, in a short space of time, can immediately lead to blood clotting.
Right, I really had no idea about this heart disease aspect of air pollution. I live in Delhi, so I'm majorly allergic to dust. Okay, normal dust, forget about PM 2.5, PM 10, that is even worse. So I don't go anywhere without a mask. But I thought I was pretty much okay with sort of dealing or managing this pollution. But this is pretty scary. I did come across, anecdotally speaking, quite a few of my friends were pretty fit, healthy, they go out and play and all that. But they have been talking about, blood pressure issues. They are shocked how come they have BP. Maybe this is one of the reasons, exposure to pollution.
Absolutely. And Dr. Reddy also theorized that it's possibly behind the reason we have been seeing an increase in the heart disease in the younger populations. Normally you would think of this post 60. But now, of course, we are seeing that heart disease is coming up in post 40. Like you can be far younger than you used to be before experiencing hypertension, which is high blood pressure, heart disease, and conditions like that. So that is what is so scary about this, that all of this links back to the fact that the really young, what is known as the productive age population is becoming sicker.
Right. I think this is an important episode for everybody to listen to, because most people tend to imagine that, pollution, air pollution is to do with the lungs, which it does. And that's what I thought for the longest time.
Absolutely.
But this takes the danger one level higher.
Right. And now let's move on to your number one, Sampath, which is again something of, we are circling back to the environment again with this episode. This is to do with the Great Nicobar project. And as you pointed out in your in the first part of the episode, this is again an issue that there's not much being talked about, and it's important to delve into it deeper. Tell us a little bit about the Great Nicobar project and the impacts that it will have.
Right. I think when I was researching this particular podcast episode, to sort of get my questions in order, it sort of had the same impact that you talked about just now. It sort of, my blood pressure went up, and it was really heartbreaking to sort of read about the entire process, the plan, scale of it. This is one island that we've got which is completely pristine, as in it is untouched by all the kinds of things that we've been doing to forests in mainland India, be it in Uttarakhand, we spoke about Wayanad. I'm sure there are lots of other places, if you go and want to make a list, you will find. But this has been purely because of geographical reasons. It is the southernmost island in the Andaman and Nicobar archipelago. It is tropical forest. It's got species of plants and animals which are endemic, which means they are not available. I'm saying available like a consumer. They are not to be found anywhere else on the planet, and they are going to be sort of decimated, with this mega project coming up, 72,000 crores. This entire island is smaller than Hong Kong, okay, and it's going to, as per this plan, it's going to host a 40,000 crore transshipment terminal. Now, a transshipment terminal, for those who don't know, is a kind of a port facility wherein you transfer goods from a bigger ship to a smaller ship for a further distribution, inland or wherever. Now, there is no inland near Great Nicobar Island. It is an island in itself, okay. So what is this transshipment going to do? Not very clear. And then there is going to be at least 131 square kilometers of this forest. Out of 921 square kilometers, 131 is directly going to be decimated. More than 1 million trees cut. And you are going to have 3.5 lakh people coming and settling on this island to run this transshipment facility, to run commercial resorts, tourism projects. There's going to be a gas and solar based power plant. There's going to be a township. And as of today, there are just 8,500 people living on this island. They are scheduled tribes. and a particularly vulnerable tribal group. Neither of them are okay with this project going ahead. Their consent was initially given based on misleading information, which they subsequently withdrew their consent. And a lot of people, not just environmental rights activists or tribal rights activists, are worried. I think the ordinary citizen is also worried because this is a seismically volatile zone. It is the site of the 2004 tsunami. I think those two tribal populations I just mentioned, Shompen and Nicobar, they suffered a lot of loss of life and property in this tsunami in 2004, and it gets one earthquake a week. So are we really going to have 3.5 lakh people shift to this quake-prone, seismically risky area for a commercial project whose value is still not been properly discussed? Nobody knows much about it. And there is also this whole dimension which has been talked about, strategic importance, because we want to counter China's influence in this Andaman Sea area. We want to build whatever military, strategic, commercial project here and sort of have our say, our influence as well. But there are other less ecologically damaging ways of doing that which nobody has really explored. So there are all these questions we talk about in great detail. I'm just giving you a little glimpse of the conversation. Pankaj Seksharia is curated this book called The Great Nicobar Betrayal, which is a collection of essays by people from different fields on every single dimension of this project and what it can do to this island. And once it's done, it's done. You can't really undo it. And there is I'll just stop with this small example of the absurdity around this project, which is that in exchange for decimating 131 square kilometers of pristine tropical evergreen forest that has taken millennia to evolve to what it is today, the government of India plans to do afforestation in 260 kilometers of land in Haryana. So this is the equivalent that is being drawn to give clearance to this project. So anyway, I don't need to comment on how absurd or not it is. It's pretty evident. So these are some of the aspects we get into, and as I said, if you listen to it, I can't warn you that your blood pressure will not go up. But I think this is a conversation, a debate people should have as this project is about to take off.
Absolutely, Sampath, and it circles very nicely back to some of the previous issues that we've been talking about: environmental importance versus development, and also, of course, about protecting our tribals and our tribals' rights, which we talked about during the Fortified Rights episode as well. So it just provides us with an glimpse into how, as you said, their rights and their concerns are not being taken seriously, whereas you're planning to dump 350,000 people into a tiny island that is already earthquake prone, and you're planning to destroy pristine acres and acres and acres of absolutely pristine forest at a time when more than ever we need forests. And we need to protect the few remaining pristine zones that we have left in our country. So it's really tragic, and I can imagine that my blood pressure would also rise. Listening to this, what you've said already sounds horrendous, and I really hope for all of our sakes that this does not go through. And it again, coming back to how on earth it even received clearance from the Union Ministry of Environment, that is what is so shocking about this.
Right, absolutely. And I think a pretty grim selection of topics, unfortunately, we couldn't help it.
Yes. Well, at least one thing you can't say about India is that it doesn't give you news. Every single day, there is a whole host of news items for you to look into.
Yes. And that way, I think 2024 has been a pretty richly sort of paying year. We have got, I think, one news, I think, was not a grim one, which was the electoral bond issue.
Yes.
I think we did one on this.
Yes.
That's definitely a positive one. I think 1 out of 12, I guess. I think the rest. No. There is one more. The Kenyans getting their airport back. I think that's also not a negative one, it's a positive one. So 2 out of 12 is not, I think, a bad 12 for 12 months of the year, I guess.
Absolutely. And it's nice to know that there are these little pinpricks of hope in between all of the lots of not very nice news that we discuss on a day-to-day basis. And on that note, perhaps we should wish our listeners a very happy holiday season and a lovely and prosperous new year.
Yes, I think we should, and I hope they celebrate their new year thinking happy thoughts while listening to these grim episodes of InFocus.
And continue to listen to more InFocus podcasts, as we will continue to try and bring you all of the news that we think is important for you to take a deep dive into.
Great. Yes, absolutely. On that note, it's a goodbye from us, and we wish you a very happy 2025. All the very best.
Thank you for listening in, and please keep listening in. Thank you.
InFocus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for InFocus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.